Thank you all for joining us for the Test Prep Workshop GRE and GMAT workshop. Joining us today is Clay Cooper, attorney and president and founder of Cooper Test Prep. They're going to introduce you to cost, duration, format, knowledge tested, and scoring system of the GRE and GMAT. I'm going to hand it over to him to get us started.
Great. Thank you. Is it Ege? Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, perfectly.
Awesome. Thank you, Ege. It's nice to meet you. And
Nice to meet
thanks for
you.
handing it over. Can everybody see and hear me okay? And you can chat into the chat window to let me know. I am actually traveling right now. I am in Colombia in South America. So I had a couple connection issues that I wasn't anticipating. And if it looks like I'm presenting from an Airbnb in South America, that's only because I'm presenting from an Airbnb in South America. So please forgive me. This is my off season in test prep. It's a little bit slower this time of year. So that's when I try to get out and explore a little bit. I also would normally be wearing a suit, but I did not bring one with me on the trip. So thank you all for being here, first of all. It's always a pleasure to get to speak to people who are interested in the GRE, GMAT, any test really, and especially through the Grad Academy. Do you all know Nevena, Marlena, and the other administrators with the Grad Academy? Do you all know them personally? Or I guess to have some interactions with them through your involvement with the Grad Academy? I just want to make sure I understand kind of how things work. Okay. Well, so I'm not super familiar with like the mechanics of the Grad Academy and what your involvement is with those folks or that program. But I can tell you, I have interacted with and gotten to know Nevena and Marlena very well over the past couple of years. And well, I say very well, pretty well over the past couple of years. And they are wonderful humans. So if you get the chance to meet them, speak with them, talk with them, take advantage of the help they're offering you, I highly encourage you to do so. They have both Nevin and Marlena and the other staff as well. Those Nevin and Marlena are just the two that I know best. They're just wonderful people, and I know they're very dedicated to helping students achieve their goals. So, so thank you all for being here. Let me kind of go over the agenda real quick, and then I'll give you a little bit of an idea of who I am, just so you guys understand why or whether you should care what I have to say about these tests. So everybody can see the slides as well. Is that correct?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. And those of you who are attending, please feel free to chat freely in the chat window. I teach and tutor online a lot, all day, every day for the most part, and my experience has been overwhelmingly that when the attendees are chatting in the window and are actively involved in the presentation that way, they get more out of it. You just can't help but be more plugged into what's going on if you're actively chatting in the window. So if you have a question, please feel free to shout it out in the window. I'll try and address it as well as I can. Or if you just want to say hi or whatever it is, feel free to chat it out. All right, so let's take a quick look at our agenda. If this is Grad Academy, is there undergrads here too? I believe so, Jenny, but I'm not actually sure. I tell you what, I'll ask around about that in just a second. That's part of what I like to do to get started and make sure we're on the same page. So yeah, good question. So nice, awesome. Let's talk about our agenda today. I'm going to introduce you guys basically to me and to the topic really quickly, and then we'll get into cost comparison between the two tests. And then for each of the tests, I will try to run through how their computer adaptive testing systems work, how their quantitative sections work, how their verbal sections work, general suggestions about how you should prepare, and then I'll happily take your questions at the end. So with respect to questions, if you have a question, please shout it out in the chat window or on the microphone, either one at either point. I'm happy to try and answer them as I go. If there is a question that either isn't perfectly on topic or just would be better answered later, I will take questions at the end as well. Let me also say that I was just telling Nevin and Marlena this. The presentation I put together, I think it's like 100 slides or something. There is far more information that I have and would like to share with you about these two tests than we actually have time for today. So I'm going to be going through it really quickly. Please forgive me for that. I'm just trying to cover it all. And then remember to, I'm going to give you my personal contact info. So if you want a copy of these slides, or if you have other questions that you'd like to ask, etc., please don't hesitate to reach out. All right. So let me tell you briefly about who I am, just basically to establish whether you should care at all what I have to say about standardized tests. As Ege mentioned, my name is Clay Cooper. I am a Las Vegas local, even though I'm somewhere else right now. I do live and work in Las Vegas. I'm the president and founder of Cooper Test Prep. And as you can imagine from the name, we make donuts. No, I'm just kidding. We do test prep. I used to work at a Shark Tank test prep company that was based in Las Vegas. Actually, that's how I ended up in Las Vegas, was moving here to work for that company. After a while, and after becoming an attorney, I started my own test prep company. The relevant information you all care about probably most is that this should actually say both GMAT and GRE. I have high 99th percentile, which is to say 99.8th percentile or better GMAT and GRE scores. I have the same high 99th percentile LSAT scores. I've passed both the Nevada and California bars. I have actually 3 perfect scores of 1600 on the SAT. 1 perfect score of 36 on the ACT, and 1 perfect selection score index on the PSAT. So please forgive me, first of all, for this super obnoxious flexing about my test scores. I want to assure you guys, I do not go around in real life talking about my test scores. I understand that it's obnoxious and it's blatant self-promotion. The reason I bring it up at the beginning of the presentation is that I'm about to spend an hour yelling at you about the GMAT and the GRE, right? And so it helps to kind of give you an idea in the very beginning of why I think that I'm qualified to dispense advice about these. Does that make sense? So if it's super obnoxious for me to flex on the internet about my standardized test scores, please forgive me. I promise there is a point, and I'll leave it alone after that. The point is, I work all day, every day in test prep. My profession for almost the entirety of the last 12 years has been, thank you. My profession for almost the entirety of the last 12 years has been helping other folks get to their test score goals. That's what I do all day, every day. As Ege mentioned, I actually am an attorney, a practicing attorney here in Las Vegas. I graduated from UNLV's Boyd School of Law. I actually started law school at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and then transferred to Boyd at UNLV and finished there. I have practiced law full time at points in the past, but these days I actually don't practice very much at all because I do test prep all day, every day. So I say all that to say, guys, I literally am a professional test nerd. This is really all I do anymore. It is what my business is. It is my profession. So if you have test prep questions or admissions process questions, I would love to help you with those. Forgive me for the conceit, but I like to think I'm qualified to help you with those. I'd love to answer them for you however I can. If I give you advice, if I give you medical advice, please ignore me. I don't know what I'm talking about. If I try to diagnose what's wrong with your car, please ignore me. I don't know what I'm talking about. But when it comes to standardized tests, you can trust my advice. All right. Let's see. This is more just shameless flexing. Probably the most relevant thing to you guys on here is that I have lots of students, lots of former clients and students who've been admitted to the Lee Business School and to various other graduate programs at UNLV. Lots of students who've been admitted to Boyd as well. So tell me this, actually, just so I can get a feel for you guys. How many of us are considering business school, if any? How many of us are considering pursuing an MBA? Okay, so I got a thumbs up from Marina. You know what would help me, guys, actually, if you all don't mind? If you could just do yes or no in the chat, because I'm teaching from my tiny little laptop screen, and I can't do the presentation and the chat and the participant window all at once. But okay, so some of us at least are considering an MBA or an MIS as well, which is, if I understand correctly, fairly similar in its requirements to an MBA. Cool. How many of us are considering just some other form of graduate school? PhD. Is anybody considering law school? Lots of PhD potentials. Cool. Is anyone considering law school? No? Good. Smart group. Don't go to law school. No, I'm just kidding. If you are considering law school, I'm happy to offer any advice that's relevant there too. I joke. Tell me this, those of you who are looking at getting a PhD, if you don't mind me asking, in what field? It always helps me to just make sure I understand who my audience is. Oh, great. My two, that's really cool. By the way, if I say any of your names and I don't say it correctly, please correct me. I want to show you the courtesy of pronouncing your name correctly, but sometimes I need help to do that. So I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Me too. Okay. So me too. Actually, that's awesome. I studied economics in undergrad. That was what my bachelor's was in. Although I don't really remember too much of it, but anthropology, clinical psychology. Hey, that's great. Really cool. Awesome. Maybe you guys can be my therapist after you get your PhDs in clinical psychology. It'll be great. All right, awesome. So thank you for telling me that, guys. It helps me to kind of get a feel for with whom I am speaking. So I guess then to that extent, or to that end, I do have several former clients who are at Lee or have gone to Lee, several former clients who've been admitted to other graduate programs at UNLV and at many, many other schools besides. And then lots of students in law school as well. But cool. All right, good to know. I do teach and tutor. Oh, so let me give you the final self-promotional angle. My business is that I teach and tutor graduate school tests primarily. GRE, GMAT, LSAT, etc. So the way that I end up giving presentations like these to potential or students who are potentially interested in taking these tests is that I teach and tutor. I teach classes on these tests and I offer one-on-one tutoring in these tests. So I'm going to give you my personal info. This is my personal cell number on me right now, and this is my personal email address. Please feel free to save and use either my number or my email address, text, call, email, however you'd like to reach out. If there's anything I can do to help you with the test, I assure you I won't give you a hard sell. If you call me, I'm not going to spend the conversation trying to convince you to buy tutoring from me or anything like that. My experience has been that if I can be helpful to you all in pursuing your test prep goals, that's good for business in the long run. So I just try to focus on being helpful to you all. I do both GMAT and GRE tutoring and teaching though, okay? And very relevantly, if you are interested, I offer discounts for Grad Academy students. All right. So these are old course flyers. I used to run, or not used to, I have in the past run several GMAT and GRE courses on UNLV's campus that have been pretty well received. I don't have any currently scheduled, but if there is interest in those, reach out, shoot me an email or a text if you might be interested in one of those, and we'll see if we can get a critical mass of students going to make it happen. Also, probably most relevantly, I'm going to put this link in the chat, but I created just a little page on my website in preparation for this presentation that you guys can go to if you want a copy of these notes. So I've got this PDF presentation that I'm presenting. If you would like for me to send you a copy of it, no charge at all, obviously, just go to this address. I just put it in the chat. Go to that address and leave me your info. And it doesn't obligate you to anything. It's super, low key. Just leave me your name, email, and info, and I can send you a copy of today's presentation. You may find it helpful. There's a lot of good information in the presentation, okay? Obviously, I'm biased. I made it, but I think so. So, cool. Does all that make sense? Yeah, hopefully. All right, cool. So first, let me talk about the cost. The new, and forgive me if you can hear the traffic of Bogota honking at me outside my window as I present, guys. I apologize. This is the quietest presentation place I could find. Let's talk about the cost of the two tests. First, the GMAT cost is $275. And in fact, of all the graduate school standardized tests, with the possible exception of the MCAT, I think the GMAT is the most expensive. So the GMAT is $275. I know that was specifically mentioned as a talking point today, so I want to address that. GMAT cost $275. That includes the ability to send your score to up to 5 schools as well. So and for those of us who are considering the possibility of applying to multiple schools, just know that that cost will allow you to send it up to 5. The GRE cost is currently $205, although it's going up to $220 on November 1st, so very soon. As we'll talk about when we talk about how you take the test, you could go ahead and schedule your GRE if you'd like to save a little money on it. However, I am not sure if the cost increase applies to tests that happen after November 1st or only to tests that are scheduled after November 1st. So you'll have to explore that for yourself. But does that cost info make sense? Any questions about the cost of either test before we move on? Cool. All right. Well, moving right along then. So let's talk about the GMAT first, and I'll kind of try to present in parallel a little bit, but the reality is I'm going to have to talk about the GMAT first and then the GRE. Or actually, you know what? I take that back. We can vote on it. Would you guys prefer to hear about the GMAT first or the GRE first? You tell me. Let's see. So 2 votes for GMAT, no preference. Anybody else care to weigh in? No GMAT? Okay, I tell you what. 3 GMATs and 2 no preferences, so we're good. Awesome. We'll start with the GMAT then. So the GMAT is administered remotely. You could do the Secure Testing Center administration. Last time I checked, that was still an option. And actually, it might be worth considering more than you realize. So very briefly, guys, the way the Secure Testing Center administration works for both tests, both the GMAT and the GRE, is that they are administered in it's like a corporate lockdown facility. Basically, you go to a building and they take your ID and they like check your pockets, and it's honestly stricter security than getting on an airplane, truly. And then once they've like checked you in and made sure you don't have any ability to cheat on you, taking all your stuff away and put it in a locker, they put you in a cubicle with like noise canceling headphones, or not even noise canceling, but the big like earmuff headphones, right? In a cubicle with some other people, and you're kind of in your own little world, and you take the test on a computer. Now, not everybody enjoys that. The Secure Testing Center environment is pretty strict. It can be a little bit unnerving. Do any of us suffer from test day anxiety, or at least think we might suffer from test day anxiety? Yeah, it's a very real thing. So let me just kind of explain my experience. My experience has been that the Secure Testing Center administration can sometimes exacerbate test day anxiety, because you really do feel like you're, I don't know, it's just really intense. However, the alternative that is now, like, since the pandemic has become an option is remote testing. This didn't exist for the GMAT, LSAT, GRE before the pandemic, but obviously now it's an option. Here's the thing though, people often think that taking the test at home will be easier or better. My experience actually has been that it is not always easier or better. I guess you guys probably don't even need me to tell you this. You've probably had your own experience. Tell me this. Have any of us ever been at home planning to do a test online or a homework assignment or any kind of work or meeting online, needing quiet and focus, but something happened, whether it's a dog barking or the doorbell ringing or the lawn guy's coming or sister needs help with something? Has that ever happened to you guys? And what I expected to be my very calm, quiet home environment turns out to be anything but. Oh, yeah. Oh, I know it. My dog, Johnny Rose, goes nuts. I teach classes from home all the time, and my dog will absolutely lose his mind. And then he'll just get bored and he'll come in and like sit on my feet until I acknowledge him. So I get it. My point is, don't assume that taking the test at home is necessarily a better option. Does that make sense? For a lot of people, taking the test at the Secure Testing Center, even though it can be a little bit uncomfortable, and it's kind of an annoyance to have to go down there and do it, it can be a much more quiet and controlled environment. So just keep that in mind, okay? So let's talk about the 4 sections of the GMAT: the analytical writing assessment, integrated reasoning, quantitative, and verbal. The main ones we're gonna focus on are quantitative and verbal for a couple of reasons. Tell me this, is anybody considering applying for an MBA, applying to study for an MBA at the Lee Business School at UNLV? Cool. All right, several of us. Good. The reason I bring up quantitative and verbal is that the Lee Business School, like many other schools, only looks at these 2 sections when you take the GMAT. Does that make sense? So when you take the GMAT, you'll have to do the analytical writing and the integrated reasoning, but Lee Business School doesn't look at those scores. Does that make sense? Quantitative and verbal are kind of the meat of the test. They are the most important parts of it. They're the most traditional parts of it. Analytical writing and integrated reasoning, some schools take them seriously. And obviously, you should find out from the school that you're applying to whether and how much each section matters. But my experience has been quantitative and verbal are by far the most important ones for most schools. Does that make sense? So we'll focus primarily on those. Can you guys hear these horns honking in the background? I hope that's not coming through, but it probably is. Okay, good. Well, then there aren't horns honking. What? Cool. Usually, I have this wonderful like video studio at home that I present from because that's like what I do every day, right? I teach online, and it's like perfectly, you know, it's set up really well. But when I'm on the road, I got to kind of take what I got. So, all right. Very interestingly, on the GMAT, you can't skip, return, or change your answers to questions. I'll repeat that. On the GMAT, you can't skip, return, or change your answers to questions. You can't move on to the next question until you answer this one. And once you've answered this one and moved on, it's over. You can't answer, you can't come back to it. That's really interesting. And that's one of the main differences between the GMAT and the GRE. Okay. The GRE obviously, well, not obviously, but the GRE does not work that way. On the GRE, you can skip around. It's a much more natural kind of progression. On the GMAT though, you can't. The GMAT has a couple idiosyncrasies like that can make it really difficult for those of us who are unprepared. The biggest thing to know about that is just you got to practice it. Does that make sense? As you can imagine, taking a really strict, really difficult standardized test is largely a matter of getting used to how that particular test works. That's a big part of what your prep needs to be covering. And especially this aspect of the GMAT can be unusual. Does that make sense? It's just when you have to get used to what it's like to take a test where the timing is really strict and you can't afford to not finish, but at the same time, you can't skip around. And once you answer a question, it's over and you can't come back to it and you can't move on to the next question until you answer this one. So the only way to get used to that is to practice, practice, practice. Does that make sense? Interestingly, though, you can choose your section order on the GMAT. There are a few different options. You can do the analytical writing assessment, integrated reasoning, quantitative, and then verbal. You can do verbal, quantitative, integrated, analytical, or you can do quantitative, verbal, integrated, analytical. I absolutely recommend one of these latter two options. Can anybody guess why? Does anybody want to take a stab at guessing why I recommend either this one or this one? Quantitative, verbal, integrated analytical, or verbal quantitative integrated analytical? Yeah, because the analytical and integrated are not as important, right? And so we don't want to take them first while you're fresh. You want to take the harder sections, the ones that matter more to you while you're fresh. Does that make sense? Essentially, mental fatigue is a very real thing, especially in standardized tests. So we want to keep that in mind and do the important sections first if we can. All right, so here's a brief breakdown of the format of the various sections or the formats of the various sections in the GMAT. The two we care most about are quantitative reasoning and verbal reasoning. Note that there's only one quantitative reasoning section on the GMAT and there's only one verbal reasoning section on the GMAT. The GRE is the opposite, well, not the opposite, but double that. There are two verbals and two quantitatives. I just held up three fingers and said two. There are two verbals and two quantitatives on the GRE. Do we understand that difference? Interestingly, although on the GMAT, there's only one section of each kind like this, and on the GRE, there's two sections. The GMAT's sections are roughly twice as long. Does that make sense? Not exactly, but roughly twice as long. We following that? Cool. And then the score range, we could talk about the scores a little bit later. It's complicated with the GMAT, but essentially this is the format that you need to know. You've got 2 minutes per question in quantitative and a little bit less than 2 minutes per question in verbal. All this makes sense thus far? Yeah, no, don't care. Cool. All right. Do we have any questions about the format of the various sections, the formats of the various sections? 1 point increments. Yeah, that all that means, Tam, is that they change in 1 point increments. In other words, you can't get a 6.2, but you can get a 6 or a 7 or an 8. Does that make sense? Good question. Yep. Awesome. All right. So let's keep moving. Let's talk a little bit about the quantitative section. Quantitative essentially just means math, right? It means other relating to quantities, which for the purposes of a standardized test essentially means the math section, math and data analysis, right? So the format of the quantitative section on the GMAT, 62 minutes, 31 questions, exactly 2 minutes per question. Everything is multiple choice. One of the key differences between the GMAT's quantitative and the GRE's quantitative is that the GRE, some of its questions, you have to type in an answer, a numerical answer. On the GMAT, it's entirely multiple choice. Also, I should have said this to begin with. I'm sorry, guys. I absent-mindedly skipped a really important point. Let me just back up and generalize here. Do we know yet? Are you all certain which test you're going to take? Tell me that. Are we all certain which of these two tests that we're going to take? Is there anyone here today who has questions about which test to take? And if you do, that's perfectly reasonable. Okay, good. All right, so I'll bring that part of the presentation in. Part of the value of this presentation is having somebody like me who does this all day, every day, and is intimately familiar with the similarities and differences between these two tests. Kind of walk you through what the similarities and differences are, so you can make a better decision about which one to take. And that's kind of what I was getting at. I wanted to make sure that there are at least some of us in here who need that information, so it's worth mentioning. So I'll continue to point out similarities and differences between the tests. The section types are largely similar. There's quantitative and verbal on the GMAT and on the GRE. And to be frank, on each of those tests, there are also other sections that aren't as important. On both the GMAT and the GRE, quantitative and verbal tend to be the ones taken most seriously by schools. So keep that in mind. And we'll do, I tell you what, I'll finish up with a compare and contrast section. Let me make a little note that I want to do that. Okay. All right, awesome. So note that in the quantitative section, so kind of returning to our discussion of the format of the quantitative section of the GMAT, it's all multiple choice. You have exactly 2 minutes per question. There's a huge penalty for unanswered questions on the GMAT. So if you take the GMAT in every section of the GMAT, no matter what, you must answer every question. Does everybody who's considering the GMAT understand that? No matter what happens, you must answer every question. Okay. And I'm actually going to give you the exact same advice about the GRE. That is a similarity, but the GMAT will deduct points if you leave any question blank. In fact, it's kind of a lot of points. Does that make sense? The GRE just simply won't award points if you leave a question blank. Although, for our purposes, that's just as bad. Does that make sense? Yeah. So you guys may remember taking like the SAT and the ACT. If you recall, on the SAT and the ACT, there is no penalty for guessing. Do you guys remember that? There's no penalty for guessing, which means if you don't get to a question, if you like run out of time and don't get to a question, you should still answer it, because a blind guess will sometimes be correct. Does that make sense? No, great question, Jenny. Let me come back to that in just a second. But does everybody understand that no matter what on each test, I don't care what else happens on test day, I don't care if the building burns down, you still have to answer every question no matter what on both of these tests. Everybody understand that? I often joke with my clients that there's only one way to like really make me mad at you, like to make me mad, there's really only one way you can do that. And that's if you leave a question blank on the test. Okay. If you leave a question blank on one of these tests, I will show up at your house and yell at you on your front porch. Okay. Right there in front of all your neighbors and everything. And it's humiliating. So I don't want to go there. Come on. Just answer every question and then we don't have to worry about it. All right. Cool. All right. Both tests use what's called computer adaptive testing, which means the test adjusts its difficulty depending on how well you are doing. So let me reiterate that. Both the GMAT and the GRE use some form of computer adaptive testing, which means each of these tests adjusts its difficulty in response to how well you are doing. Does everybody understand that basic idea? So it's kind of brutal if you think about it. In other words, if you're getting a lot of questions right, what's going to happen? The questions are going to start to get harder, right? The good news is the inverse is true as well. If you are getting, or not the inverse, but the converse, or the opposite is true as well. If you are getting a lot of questions wrong, the questions will tend to get easier. Does that make sense? Now, the way the GMAT's computer adaptive testing system works is different from the way the GRE's computer adaptive testing system works. And I'll give you more on that in just a minute. Yeah, I'll explain that in just a second. Essentially, for the GRE, they do it section by section. Okay. So actually, I'll just explain it now. On the GMAT, this happens live on a question by question basis. Does that make sense? Actually, you know what? Let me open a whiteboard so I can just write this more simply. It'll be easier. Cool. So here's how it works. The GMAT's computer adaptive testing system. Here's how it works. Each question, every time I click submit on my answer to one question and see another question. The new question has its difficulty adjusted in light of how many questions I have gotten right so far. In other words, CAT works on a question by question basis. Make sense? And this is their justification for not allowing you to skip around. Hence the rule preventing you from returning to questions. Got it? On the GRE, it happens on a section by section basis. Remember, on the GMAT, you have one long verbal section and one long quantitative section, right? So one long verbal section, one long quant section. On the GRE, you have two short ones. Two short verbals, two short quants, right? And the difficulty of the second section of each type will depend on how well you did on the first section of that type. In other words, CAT, it's called SLA for the GRE, as if we need more acronyms, works on a section by section basis. Does that make sense? Dropped my stylus. Are we following this, guys? Cool. All right. The big thing to know about CAT is essentially that like it shouldn't change your approach at all. Okay. We'll talk more about this in just a second, but don't try to outsmart CAT. Students, understandably, I understand why people think this, but students sometimes arrive at the conclusion, sometimes conclude that to kind of battle against the CAT algorithm, so to speak, it makes sense to occasionally strategically miss a question. This is an understandable conclusion to reach, and it is 1000% incorrect. Does everybody understand that? Never, ever purposefully miss a question. Always try to get them right. Okay. We following that, guys? You could see why people might think that there's a time and place where it might help to miss a question so that the test adjusts its difficulty to get easier. But I promise you guys, I do this all day, every day for a living. That is never, never, never the case. Okay. I promise it is never going to help you to purposefully miss a question, no matter what else is happening. Remember that. All right. It's worth noting that the GMAT does not allow you to have a calculator of any kind. Does everybody understand that? No calculator on the GMAT, which is interesting because the GMAT does require you sometimes to do arithmetic, like calculations. Does that make sense? So keep that in mind. Arithmetic is a part of the quantitative section on the GMAT. And if I want to do well in the GMAT, I need to be prepared to do arithmetic, like pure calculations. We following that? Okay. Don't just assume, though, that means if you're bad at calculations, you should take the GRE. Remember, everything is scored on a curve, right? Oversimplification, but both tests are scored on a curve, which means it's not me versus the test, it's me versus my peers. Does that make sense? Cool. Now, again, that's a dramatic oversimplification of how it actually works, but that is pretty much the practical reality. They're both scored on a curve, which means, so if calculations are hard for me, that doesn't necessarily mean I shouldn't take this test. We following that? Because they are hard for everyone, right? The question isn't, are calculations hard for me? The question is, are calculations harder for me than they are for my peers? We're following that? It's not about being good or bad. It's about being better or worse than your peers. All right, cool. And then in terms of scratch paper, if you take the test at a secure testing center, and if you go into the testing center, you get a erasable scratch booklet. It's like a booklet of laminated pages, and you get a pen to write on it that can't be erased, basically. And the reason they do that is so they can check it and make sure you're not cheating. it takes a little getting used to, but it's no big deal. If you take it at home, you get scratch paper, okay? We already talked about computer adaptive testing. The biggest thing to know about computer adaptive testing is that it really shouldn't factor into your approach. Does that make sense? It really shouldn't factor into your approach, except that two things. Computer adaptive testing helps some in that no one question is as important as it would be without computer adaptive testing. For instance, I often have SAT tutoring clients who are trying to get a perfect score on a particular section, right? And if they miss a single question, it's usually over. That's not true on the GMAT or the GRE with their computer adaptive testing. The other thing to remember with computer adaptive testing is that on the GMAT especially, the questions are going to get harder or easier until you are missing about half of them. Does that make sense? The questions are going to get harder or easier until you're missing about half of them on the GMAT, because the GMAT adjusts question by question. The GRE, it's not quite like that because the second section is set before you begin it based on your results in the first section. Are we following that? So the GRE can't adapt to the exact point where you're missing half the questions, although they try to do that essentially. The GMAT though does. The GMAT will get harder and harder or easier and easier until you're batting about 500. Does that make sense? It will adjust difficulty until you're getting around 50% of them correct. Now, the biggest kind of takeaway from this is that are there any of us out there who think that missing a question, well, let me rephrase that. Sometimes I have clients or students who aren't used to missing questions on these tests. Does that describe anybody in this room? Probably would be my guess. And I get that, I understand, but what we have to understand is a very important skill, especially on the GMAT, is what? What do you guys think I'm about to say? If you're going to miss half the questions, that's part of it. Yeah, that's really important. That's not the one I was thinking of right now. A very important skill in the GMAT is accepting the reality that I'm going to miss lots of questions. Does that make sense? And not getting hung up on any problem I can't figure out. Are we following that? Here's what I mean. Sometimes my students are like overachievers, super focused, highly driven. And if there's a problem they can't figure out, they will stay on it until they figure it out. And you can't do that on the GMAT. This test will wipe the floor with you if you do that. Does that make sense? Because you have to stay on pace. There's a good, it's a good quality to have for sure. The thing is, there is a huge penalty for not answering questions, which means you have to stay on pace. You have to. If you don't, it will not go well for you. But if you are going to miss half of the questions, then staying on pace often means what? Failing, literally giving up. Does that make sense? Okay, so it is a very, very important skill, especially on the GMAT, because it's question by question. It's a very important skill to know when to give up and move on. Does everybody understand what I mean by that? You got to be able to do it. What do you think is the best way to get good at knowing when to give up and move on? What do you guys think I'm about to say as like, here's how you get better at that? Practice, practice, practice. There is no substitute for practice, right? So this experience is strange and you must practice it a lot beforehand. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So that's computer adaptive testing. We already talked about that. It happens on both quantitative and verbal, but they're independent of each other. Does that make sense? In other words, the computer adaptive testing happens in the quantitative section and it happens in the verbal section, but they're not connected because most people are better at one than at the other. Make sense? If you take a mock test and your true score is based on your peers, oh yeah, it's based on the people who actually took that one. Does that make sense? It basically uses an old curve, a historical curve. Does that make sense? The thing is, though, it's still really reliable because the group of people who take the test is so large that it virtually never changes very much. If you get any group of humans that's sufficiently large, their performance in a highly skilled activity is going to be pretty stable, if that makes sense. Their performance as a group, that is. Cool. All right, so you got to stay on pace. Here's a pacing benchmark set for the quantitative section. So I think, Jenny, you asked the question earlier. Essentially, how does pacing work, right? Is there a clock that gives me 2 minutes per question? No, there isn't. And if you want to stay on pace, you got to figure out how to check your pace as you're going. And that's actually really hard. So what I've done is created a little table of benchmarks here. Here's how you do it. There is a timer that will show you how much time has elapsed or is remaining, and you should memorize these benchmarks so that after you've completed 16 questions, you can very quickly look and see if you're on pace or not. Does that make sense? You do not want to have to figure out this math while the clock is running. Does everybody understand that? So your pacing benchmarks should be memorized, not figured out on the fly. Got it? The reason is, we're already having a hard time with the math in this section, right? So the last thing we want to do is make our life even harder by having to do pacing math to see if I'm on pace for the math questions, right? Cool. And again, guys, if you want a copy of these materials with these benchmarks and a bunch of others in there, because I'm still like not even 10% of the way done with this presentation, I'll give you the URL again. And I'm happy to send you this stuff. I think you guys may find it useful. Here's the URL. Just go there, leave me your info, and I will send you a copy of the presentation. Cool. All right, so those are the pacing benchmarks for verbal. Remember, you can't leave anything blank. You get 3 different scores in the GMAT for each section. You get your percentile score, which is the most inherently meaningful number. It's what percentage of your peers you beat. You get your scaled score, which varies between 1 and 51. And then you get your overall scaled score between 200 and 800, okay? This is the most important number for most people, even though the percentile score is actually the most inherently meaningful number. I tell you what, very briefly, guys, scoring on both of these tests is complicated and confusing. And unfortunately, we've got 11 minutes left and I don't have time to explain it all in detail, but I would be happy to explain any of this to any of you if you want to reach out. So again, I gave you the URL. What would be even more direct and easy is here is my cell number. Call or text me anytime. And here's my email. Okay. If you guys have questions about the scoring or anything else in this presentation, hit me up. I'm happy to help. All right. So let's talk about the question types very briefly. On the GMAT quantitative section, the question types are problem solving, which are just math problems, and then data sufficiency questions. Data sufficiency questions look like this. They give you a question and then they give you 2 statements, and your job is to determine whether, in light of the statements, you have enough information to answer the question. As you can see here, data sufficiency questions are baffling. They are extremely confusing. And if you want to score well on these questions, you have got to be prepared by having practiced a lot. I can give you a whole procedure to follow that you can memorize that will make these questions a lot easier to deal with. But if you think this isn't that hard, I encourage you to practice it a couple times. It will blow your mind how hard it is. All right, so those are the question types and quantitative in the GMAT. Note a list of topics that are covered and that are not covered. And actually, interestingly, this table is identical for the GMAT and the GRE, which is good news. What is covered? Algebra, arithmetic, geometry, number properties. Number properties mean things like prime numbers, even numbers, odd numbers, multiples, factors, infinite numbers, rational numbers, odds, evens, etc. Okay. Not covered: calculus, trigonometry, higher level algebra, or matrices. And again, that list is the same for the 2 tests. We've talked about all that. Here's some example questions: problem solving. And again, here's another problem solving question. If you want a copy of these materials, reach out to me. I'm happy to give it to you. All right, so let's move right along. These are data sufficiency questions as well. A couple broad tips, and this is labeled how to tackle quantitative on the GMAT, but actually every tip on this slide applies to every section of each test, okay? So are we still plugged in? Because this is actually really, really important. We good? I know I'm yelling at you guys at high speed and throwing a lot of information at you, but okay. So a couple broad notes from somebody who does this all day, every day for a living. You ready? There's no excuse for being surprised on test day. There are abundant resources available to you to find out what's coming on this test and be prepared for it. So if you show up to take the test and you're surprised by anything you see, that means you failed to prepare sufficiently. There's no excuse for being uncomfortable on test day either. Even though the testing environment and the testing process is kind of inherently uncomfortable, you shouldn't be uncomfortable, or you shouldn't be made uncomfortable by it, because again, you can practice. If you want information on how to practice and where to find these resources, reach out to me. I'm happy to help. As a broad piece of advice for all test prep, pinpoint what you know and what you don't. As a famous idiot once said, we have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, right? We don't want to be in the unknown unknowns category. It is very helpful to pinpoint what you're good at, what you're bad at, and what you need to work on to get better. Does that make sense? Another big point in all test prep is having a roadmap, which essentially allows you to stay focused on the big picture and retain perspective when the going gets tough. If you are really trying to do yourself justice on the GMAT or GRE, you might spend several months studying for it. And as you can imagine, there are points in that process that can be very discouraging and disheartening. And so having a roadmap before you begin studying that kind of outlines how the whole study period is going to go for you is extremely important. With all my tutoring and tutoring clients, I make them do this to begin with. We work through it together. So if you want help with that, holler. I'm happy to help. But having a roadmap will prevent you from giving up and burning out. It's really, really important. Treat it like a job. Now, my guess is I probably don't have to lecture the people in this room too much about this part, because if you're in this room right now listening to me speak, then you're obviously showing signs of professionalism and dedication to your goals. So is it fair to say that you guys are all, I don't know even how to ask that question. So instead of asking that question, I'll just make the observation. My guess is if you're listening to me talk right now, you are professional, hardworking, and disciplined, and that should serve you well. Treat your test prep like a job. There are a bunch of resources that can make you better at it. It's hard to get better. It takes work, but you can do it. Okay. And this is a big one too. Don't reinvent the wheel. Okay. Don't reinvent the wheel. Let me show you an example. Look at number 5 here. This question looks ridiculously confusing. Yeah. Would you guys agree with that? Okay. And let me actually just make the observation. Even if it doesn't look ridiculously confusing to you, I promise it is. Again, this is my profession, and I can tell you that this question, if it doesn't look ridiculously confusing, it absolutely is in real life. But there are nerds like me who literally my whole profession is to figure out ways to help people simplify this. And I have a whole process, and you can memorize the process, and that takes this incredibly difficult, confusing question and turns it into a simple math problem. Okay. So my point is, don't reinvent the wheel. You don't have to figure out how to do this on your own. Does that make sense? You don't have to engineer a method of attacking a data sufficiency question on the GMAT. Use the experience of nerds like me, and there are lots of others as well who can help you. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, now full speed run through the rest of it. Verbal. The format's slightly different, 65 minutes, 36 questions. The question types are different as well. You have sentence correction, which essentially, it's a lot like the SAT writing section and the ACT English section. It will show you a sentence and you have to correct its grammar and punctuation and clarity of expression. Reading comprehension is exactly what it sounds like. You get some reading to do and you get questions about it. And then critical reasoning questions are very much like LSAT questions. I don't know if any of you all are familiar with the LSAT, but it's about understanding, analyzing, and manipulating argumentation. You'll be presented with an argument and you'll have to strengthen it or weaken it or identify an assumption that on which it rests, or identify the author's conclusion or their support for the conclusion. Very, very, very interesting question types. I would love to talk to you guys about that if you're interested in it. Here's a breakdown of the relative frequencies of the different question types in the verbal section. I'll tell you what. Here's an example of sentence correction. Here's an example of a reading comprehension passage. Here's an example of a critical reasoning question. All right. So again, no excuse for being surprised. Now let's talk briefly about the GRE. I've already hit all the most important points of the GRE, so let me talk about the differences really quick. You have the quantitative and verbal sections and the analytical writing assessment. It's administered the same way the GMAT is. You can either do a testing center or do it remote. You can skip around. You cannot choose your own section order though, but you can skip around on questions. You do get a calculator on screen with the GRE. And there's no penalty for guessing. So again, you must answer every question. Note that there are 2 verbal sections and 2 quantitative sections. They're much shorter, 20 questions, 30 minutes for verbal, 20 questions, 35 minutes for quantitative. So when you take the 2 sections together of each type, they kind of add up to the corresponding section of the GMAT. Note that the sections occur in a random order and you won't know what order they're coming in beforehand. And there will be at least one section that actually doesn't even count, but you won't know which one it is or what type it is. They use it to help set the curve across different tests. Any question about the format real quick? And again, I know I'm going at warp speed and I'm going to take your questions at the end in just a minute too, but okay. There are pacing benchmarks. SLA works just like computer adaptive testing on the GMAT, except again, remember it's section by section. So I showed you there are 2 sections of each type. The difficulty of the second quantitative reasoning section is determined by how well you did on the first one. Same way with verbal. Does that part make sense? Cool. Let's see. Pacing, here are your pacing benchmarks for the GRE, right? Here are your pacing benchmarks for the GRE. There's no penalty for guessing. I'll give you the question types on the GRE quant. You have quantitative comparison, in which they'll give you 2 expressions, and your job is to figure out which one has a greater value than the other. That's a unique question type. There's a multiple choice single answer question type, which is exactly what it sounds like, old school multiple choice. And then a multiple choice multiple answer, which is a multiple choice question where more than one of the answers may be correct. And then a numeric entry question is just a math problem where you have to enter your answer as a number. Same list of topics that are and aren't covered. Here's an example of particular question types. This is multiple choice multiple answer. This is multiple choice multiple answer. This is quantitative comparison. This is quantitative comparison, etc. Let's talk about verbal really quickly on the GRE. The main thing we need to talk about is the question types. You have a reading comprehension, which again isn't a surprise. Text completion, which is like fill in the blank vocab and clarity questions. Text completion requires you to fill in the blank to make sentences make sense. And then sentence equivalence is essentially the same thing, except it's more vocab heavy. Okay. So this is reading comprehension. Okay. Both reading comprehension. This is the fill in the blank question type, and then sentence equivalence will be right here. Okay. But again, I'm happy to send you these materials because I know I'm going through them at warp speed. All right. So in summary, it is now exactly 1 hour. My understanding, I'm not the boss here, but my understanding is that if you need to go, you can. I am happy to stay and answer your questions if you have questions. I'm sure we probably do because I went super fast today to try to get through it all. clay@cooperprep.com is my email, or go to this web address to leave me your info. So if you need to go, I think you can. I mean, it's not really up to me to dismiss you, but if you need to go, it doesn't bother me at least. Maybe Ege can answer that question in more detail. But if you do have questions, I will hang out and answer them. Sorry, Ege, please go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're welcome to stay, but just for people that are about to leave or they want to leave, I would like to make a few announcements. Before they all log off, please take a moment to finish the survey, fill out the survey. It helps us a lot. And then thank you, Clay, for your time, for coming out here, teaching us things that we don't know and we wanted to get more information about. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to our participants for being here. So I hope everyone has a good rest of the day, and anybody that wants to stay and ask more questions will be here. And then I'll be happy to assist and direct you to questions if you need help with that too.
Awesome, thank you. Do I recommend any resource of GMAT to get started? Yeah, absolutely. I tell you what, Tam, if you want to email me, I'd be happy to send you some info. That's probably the simplest way to do that for sure. But there are lots of good GMAT resources. Yep, there are lots of good GMAT resources. Same thing for the GRE, actually. But again, this was a jam-packed presentation. I feel bad because I feel like I wasn't able to do justice to a lot of the stuff I wanted to talk to you guys about. But it's hard getting through it all in an hour. So if you have questions about it now, hit me
I
up.
was wondering, Clay, why do
Yeah.
they deduct points on the GMAT? Why do they deduct points for skipping a question?
It's to force you to finish the section. So the way that they score it with their computer adaptive testing means that
Oh,
yeah, so in order for the computer adaptive testing to work like they want it to,
okay.
they need you to finish the section. And so they try to force you to do that by deducting huge points if you don't, essentially. That's my understanding of it. I could be wrong, but I think that's why.
An interesting thing, I'm from Turkey, and over there, the tests, 3 wrongs take one correct answer out.
Oof, yikes.
So
Yeah,
it's
so
pretty,
penalty for guessing. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, that's very interesting. The SAT used to be like that. Like when I was in high school 400 years ago, there was a penalty for guessing on the SAT. That's not really the done thing anymore over here in our standardized tests. And the GMAT really even doesn't have a penalty for guessing. It's a penalty for not guessing, so to speak. But yeah, it's fascinating. All this stuff is fascinating. I tell you what, the GMAT, I will give them credit for their computer adaptive testing system. Although it is strange and uncomfortable, it does work better than a lot of other ones that I've seen. So um, I'll give them credit for that. But does anybody have any other test prep questions, or GMAT or GRE or grad school admissions, anything like that? This is what I do for a living, so it's like it always is exciting for me to get a group of people, a captive audience interested in it. I love it. Good. All right. Well, thank you for showing up, Maria. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for your expertise
Yeah.
and for your time. For being
Yeah,
here.
of course.